I would.
Yeah, that's why.
Last one.
Folks, we're going to go ahead and get started. So if you could take your seats, please.
Anyway, nice to see you.
Welcome, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Call the meeting to order, and we'll start with a roll call. I do know that we have one person online that's asked to participate virtually. But first we'll call roll. Shanice Brown. Wayne Creedle.
Here.
Benny Gates. Philip Hart.
Here.
Yana James.
Here.
Dave Johannes.
Yep.
Preston Lloyd.
Here.
Eric Mai.
Here.
Jennifer Mullen.
Here.
Casey Overton. Michelle Parrish.
Here.
Maritza Peachin.
Here.
Bert Pinnock. Damian Pitt. Ellen Robertson. Charlie Wilson.
Here.
Roger York.
Here.
Okay, and we have a request from Kendra Norrell to participate virtually. She is ill. Kendra, are you online? Can you hear us? You don't see if she's on. Kendra, if you're on and just are having technical difficulties, just raise your hand and we will get to you. For now, I'm gonna move on. We do have a quorum present. So again, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. As a reminder, the Advisory Council is a subcommittee of the City Planning Commission that is charged with advising the Planning Commission, the Department of Planning and Development Review, and the consultant team in the zoning ordinance revision process. The public will have an opportunity to speak during the public comment period momentarily. So for the next item, I hope you guys have all had a chance to read the July meeting notes. Were there any questions on the notes? We need a motion to approve. Yes,
No.
we have a motion in a second. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In terms of process, if we have some comments and general comments to make, when did that occur?
On the notes,
On notes and process, what we're doing, yes.
we can do, well, we can discuss it now.
That's in this, okay.
Yeah, there is going to be time. I mean, we don't have time for the agenda. We didn't have a commission discussion, but if you have comments on the notes, I would say we take them up now.
Okay, I guess it's, I don't know if it's quite in order, but, one of the things I'm concerned about, and I didn't see anything about it, I know we talked about trees and things like that, but don't see anything that we're doing to, didn't notice anything about using zoning to provide other opportunities to ensure that we create some sense of green space, even in areas where our sort of BRT plan design guideline type stuff is, to keep things up to the wall, bring things to the street, hold the corners and all that. But it seems to me as climate is affecting the world so much, we should be looking at ways to require some form of respite from the environment in our zoning.
So I know that was some of the conversation that was had around the room in our last meeting as we went to individual boards. Are you saying that it was not captured in the notes as part of that conversation? I've made note of that, and Marianne and I will talk after the fact. Maybe next month we can have some amended notes to reflect a little bit more of the discussion. Okay. Any other comments? We do have a motion in a second. I'm probably not following the exact rules here, but. All in favor? Opposed? Okay. So at this time, we'll open the public comment period. If there's any member of the public in person or online that would like to offer comment, now's the time to do so. If you could, we'll start with those in the room first. If you could just step forward and give us your name, and this is your opportunity to speak. My group today. Is there anyone online that would like to offer public comment? Okay, I'm not seeing any hands raised, so tells me everyone is just so excited to be here and happy with what we're doing. So we are going to move on to the next portion of our agenda, which is consultant presentations, and this will involve some discussion of the commission. So Renee Bieberstein is going to kick us off.
Very much. Share my screen. Okay, so I'm going to take you through, first of all, just a little bit of an update as to where we are on the the project timeline, and then I'm going to allow Carlos from UTL to give us an update on the pattern book, and then I'll come back again and give us an update on the work on the code framework that Code Studio is working on right now. I would just say this presentation is very dense. Sorry, we haven't shared it yet. We'll share it with you guys afterwards to take a look back on. There's a lot of content in it, so I think it would be great if you guys had a copy of it afterwards if you want to look back on some of the specific content within it. In terms of just what we present today, we're going to be kind of giving you a bit of a kind of overview of the work that we've done so far, but happy to kind of dive back into specific parts of it in more detail and questions afterwards. So I would say, please, if there's anything that you really don't understand as I'm presenting, please put up your hand, and I'm happy to answer right away if you've got a question about the process or what we're doing. But in terms of larger discussion questions, if you don't mind saving your questions towards the end, we'll give a chance for people to comment on UTL's work and also ours towards the end. Okay, so in terms of the presentation, I'm going to give a quick update on where we are, the pattern book and framework, the draft pattern book, and the framework. So where we are right now, you've seen this graphic before. This is just basically the same thing as before. We're now kind of in the middle of this phase 2, 3, and 4 section of the project, which is work on the pattern book and zoning code and districts framework. Just a reminder again that this phase work is really going to wrap up by November, and we're going to be switching into the detailed work on the zoning code after that, going all the way through to January 2026. Engagement that's happened so far. I'm not going to go through all these things on the slides here, but you're welcome to look back at them. We've done a number of engagement events so far. There's going to be a handful more happening this week while we're in town. So in addition to meeting with you guys, we've got 2 open houses. We have some pop-up events, and we've got meetings with stakeholders happening as well. Before this sort of first large phase of the project is done by November, we're going to be introducing an engagement plan for the second phase. So how we talk to people and how we deal with the public and stakeholders in the period sort of from November onwards to 2026. And we're going to be doing a few more engagement events again in that period up to November, including potentially speaking to the Planning Commission, obviously coming back to talk to you guys again, likely having a public workshop in September, though that might end up becoming part of the next ZAC meeting. And probably a public open house in November to present sort of the end product of this initial period of work, and additional meetings with staff and stakeholders as well, of course. The work that we've done so far. So what you're going to be seeing today is sort of the initial, not complete draft of the pattern book work and of the zoning code framework. We have a little bit of work that we're not going to be presenting yet today, but we'll see it next time on sort of some of our initial economic feasibility analysis that we've done. By the time we get to November, we're going to have another draft of the pattern book, then a final version of it, another draft of the zoning code and districts framework, and then a final version, and then a full report from the economic feasibility analysis folks as well. So I just put this in here before we get to summarizing the pattern book and the framework. I just wanted to kind of remind everybody about the relationship between the pattern book and the framework, and just say again what exactly they are, because I felt like maybe last time there was a little bit of confusion about their relationship. So here's a diagram. Hopefully this doesn't make it more complicated, but we've got essentially two streams of work going on right now. One of them is the pattern book, and the other one is the code framework. The pattern book work is being done by UTL, our sub-consultant. The code studio is working on the code framework.
Is there any way to like make the little people squares small? I mean, your presentation, more space.
Yeah.
So that like.
Yeah, I know it's tough. There's a lot of small text in this presentation. Sorry.
I don't want to know all
I guess while Marianne is going, I'll just keep talking for now though. So the pattern book is basically answering the questions of, what are the traditional patterns of built form in neighborhood development enrichment, and where is the current code misaligned with those traditional patterns? So looking for ways that we can make sort of essentially retroactively allow those things that traditional forms, traditional architecture, traditional neighborhood forms that weren't allowed in some of the more suburban zoning districts that are essentially imposed on some parts of the historic city today. The code framework is looking at what Richmond 300, the plan, says about land use and built form, and trying to figure out where the current code is misaligned with the goals of Richmond 300. So it's sort of two different things that are happening right now. Existing conditions, existing historic conditions versus the code, and Richmond 300 versus the code. A little bit better. And as we move forward, we're going to be kind of refining and doing additional work on our code framework analysis. I think part of what we know is that while there's a pretty good sort of guidance in Richmond 300, there's also a lot of room for discussion. And so we're not simply just transposing things out of Richmond 300, where we're trying to interpret them and try and make decisions based on the guidance that we get from that plan. So it's about prioritizing and balancing some of those goals. Eventually, we're going to come together with a district framework. So this is going to be the kind of initial set of zoning districts in high-level draft form for discussion. The hope is that next time we see you guys, we're going to be coming back with that in September. And that's been essentially put together the work that's happened out of both the code framework and the components of the project, which are right now kind of happening in parallel. All that's also informed by public and stakeholder input, including from you guys, and best practices analysis and the economic feasibility analysis that we're working on. So we hope to get to that district framework point by September. And then by the time we get to November, we'll be kind of moving on, like I say, to the draft and final zoning code, which is the detailed phase of that work. So taking those initial districts and really fleshing them out in more detail. The pattern book itself will kind of at that point be done by November, and we'll just kind of be its own product on the side. So it'll be a reference material that that anybody in the city could draw on for this project, but also potentially for other things that you might want to do there. Any questions about that? I just wanted to reiterate that for everybody. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Carlos to talk about the draft pattern book work.
Thank you, Renee. Nice meeting you, everybody. I was not being able to attend in person any of these meetings, but I am happy to be here. So as Renee mentioned, I'm Carlos Lyons. I work for UTL. We've been focusing on identifying existing patterns and how they align or misalign with the current zoning. And again, some of this overlapping work with the code framework. But at the end, for us, our goal is to identify nonconformities and to communicate where the existing traditional form doesn't meet the requirements from the existing zoning. which sometimes is surprising when you learn that the existing bill form is not compliant to like, and in many cases that we'll see is the majority of the existing form doesn't comply to the existing zoning. So what is an urban pattern? An urban pattern is like both the form and the use and how they just come together to in a specific area of the city. And what is a nonconformity? A nonconformity is when the property and it doesn't conform, doesn't meet the requirements of the zoning. And we speak about two different nonconformities: form, the actual physical, the building form, the setbacks, the parcel size, and then the use nonconformity. What's allowed to be what the land use is allowed to be there.
May I ask a question about that? And is it okay to ask questions? I can hold it if you want.
No,
I think initially they wanted us to hold, but
Yeah, if it's just a point of clarification, please go ahead. But if
No, I just wanted
Why
to drill down into this whole concept.
that might be a longer conversation. So let's hold on.
Our analysis is we're doing this analysis across scales. We are going from city to neighborhood to block to finalizing building. So the city and the neighborhood scales is a quantitative data-driven analysis. And when we switch to block and building scale is when we are allowed to, because of the scale getting more and more smaller dimension, we will drill into more specific form and typologies level of analysis. We wrapped up the city scale analysis where we look over all the city historic patterns and urban fabric patterns, and then mapping nonconformities where the parcel size and the building heights and with regard of the existing zoning. And also we map where, and there's a very particular thing about Richmond, where special use permits are concentrated. A lot of the nonconformities get resolved with special use permits, and there's a pattern of where those get dense. Whereas the heat map gets hotter in certain areas of the city. So in the city scale analysis, the two questions we wanted to answer is that where does the current zoning doesn't reflect existing traditional patterns, the conformity, and where can we zoom in so we can then get to representative neighborhoods to drill this into more detail. I'm gonna breeze. Well, the three things we look into was the parcel minimum size, the building height, the maximum building height, and we also look into unbuilt building height just to see where the zoning allows for some and then hasn't been built. That also speaks of a zoning is allowing for a pattern and it's not the current pattern in that area. In terms of parcel size, 27% of the parcels that zone would have required minimum parcel size are smaller than the required zoning. Not every zoning district has a minimum parcel size, but the ones that do, and it's residential, mostly residential, 27% of the parcel citywide are smaller than the minimum. And the two non-conforming districts, where most non-conformities exist, is R6 and R5. You can see where the pockets of the concentration of non-conformities in terms of parcel size. The Fan district is by far the one that consolidates most of these amount of nonconformities.
A clarifying question on that pie chart. Is the denominator all of the non-conforming parcels?
Yes. In terms of building height is way less prevalent. It's only 1% of the buildings citywide are non-conforming in terms of height, and they're mostly concentrated around downtown, which is not surprising. In terms of building height, it's mostly the TOD and the mixed-use districts that are already zoned for more, and they're still hasn't been built, and some of the industrial zones. And finally, the special use permits. This is a heat map of where most of the special use permits in the 70s are concentrated. Again, it's not surprising that is in the areas where we also saw a smaller parcel size, which will also, and we'll see when I show an example of one of the neighborhoods, which is Jackson Ward. So in collaboration with the team and the city, we identified 10 representative neighborhoods where we were gonna drill in more detail, which is Jackson Ware, Oak Grove, Church Hill North, the Phantom Museum District, Union Hill, Swansboro and Swansboro West, Oregon Hill, Northern Byron Heights, Three Chopped, and Washington Park. This is just overlaying those with the Richmond 300 land use. I'm gonna breeze through this and go straight to a neighborhood analysis. So in the neighborhood analysis, we look into finer grain where these areas have misaligned and what more detail patterns we can identify here and where the most disconnects are happening. So we took Jackson Ware as the first one to show you guys some of the work we've been doing. So in Jackson Ware, it's most of the land use is obviously is residential. There's a district south of the slide is mostly commercial. In terms of use, we identify there's a few amount of parcels that are non-conforming in terms of use, were highlighted in black. That means that is in those cases it's either multifamily or other type of uses that are not allowed in the existing zoning. In terms of parcel size, a large amount of parcel size, especially as you see on the left side, are smaller than the allowed per zoning, meaning that the historical parcel size and the zoning are not meeting each other. In terms of degree of nonconformity, some parcels are barely smaller, and some parcels like drastically smaller than the required per zoning. Here are some of the examples of parcels of that anybody will see and like, yeah, this is a tradition. This is what the city looks like, but then they wouldn't know that it's technically out of conformity with the zoning. We also look at parcel frontage, that is how wide the parcel needs to be per zoning. There's also a concentration of parcels that are way narrower, from 5% all the way to 75 to even 100% in terms of how much narrower they are with regard from zoning. And lot coverage is how much the building footprint can occupy the land. There's a significant amount of parcels that are not conforming. So overall, 69% of the parcels in Jackson Ward are non-conforming based on either lot size, lot coverage, building height, frontage, or use, with 61% being only through form. There's a 5% to use, and there's a 3% that are both the form and the land use are not conforming. So this shows like how the severe disconnect between a historical neighborhood like Jackson Ward and the zoning that is in place. Should I also detail, like, we also have Oak Grove, but it's the same process. So the next step that we're gonna get to is identify specific one, maybe 2 blocks of each neighborhood and see, okay, what are the setbacks there? What are the other more grained, fine-grained patterns that are that define the characteristics and the look and feel of the neighborhood, and compare that to the existing zoning. And then finally, we get to the building scale, where we look into more architectural language, more rather than pure zoning language.
And we're gonna do that for 10 neighborhoods at the neighborhood scale.
Yes.
We'll put this into like a report format. You guys will be able to like have it, read it, and take a look at it and understand it a little bit better.
Question. Just, is that raw data being provided to the city?
Yes. Yeah. Most of this data this analysis is using the city's data. It's just the way we've been like doing the comparison with the zoning, but all this is official data from.
Sure. Well, I guess analysis, the raw kind of analysis, is that being provided to the city in the way that they could take that information and apply it to a different neighborhood that you don't do?
Yeah. At the end of the day, it's mostly the workflow rather than the data. The data is the city's data, and it's just doing the math. And it requires some massaging of the data in a way, but yes, it definitely can be done.
I just jump in. So I think it's been very two-way in terms
Yes.
of, we did some preliminary analysis of testing.
Yes.
I think us, part of this purpose is like try and really now quantify what we've all perceived, right? And that is, all right, this neighborhood seems to get a lot of special use permits, and a lot of these special use permits seem to be something, there's some for use, but a lot of it has to do with lot dimensions. And so trying to understand, right, well, just how non-conforming is it? And as you can see, I mean, just these first two, I mean, 60% just on like lot size alone. So you, again, if for some reason these neighborhoods, something were to happen, like you could not rebuild them as they are today. And I think that's one of the issues we're trying to tackle of, all right, as we talk about some of these, especially historic established neighborhoods, like they literally can't exist today per our own codes.
Not that like non-conforming means that those places are bad. It's like when you hear the word non-conforming, oh, you're not conforming, oh, that must mean it's bad. No, it means that actually it's the opposite. It means that the zoning is bad.
And that is a very good point. And this is not unique to Richmond. It's a very common problem in historical neighborhoods in cities in the US, where the places that we love and we're like, oh, what an incredible neighborhood it is. And they're like, oh, wait, if I wanted to build this again in this specific place with the laws we have in place, it's not allowed.
Well, they were
So,
built before zoning.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
And then
So the zoning-
Layered on top, so it's not matching.
Anyway,
Charlie, do you have a clarifying question?
Well, it's kind of, but it's a big clarifying question. So I can wait.
No, I mean,
No, I think we got questions about the title.
Okay,
before
okay,
now,
okay.
and then I'll
I was just
do
trying to,
my-
since they wanted to hold, but I think
I
I know
think,
there's a lot of questions.
yeah, we
about
can have
Oh,
this.
2 rounds of questions. We can have one about
Okay.
the title book and one about our work. So
Go for it.
Yeah, so like the pattern book's super helpful. This is like really impressive to see. What's driving this particular pattern book appears to be looking only at non-conform, like where there's a great disparity between how properties were developed and how they are currently zoned. With a lot of what we've talked about coming up to this meeting being the 8th to 9th district in particular, a lot of those neighborhoods actually do conform to zoning. I just want to make sure we're like still thinking about those as well. It's a, like they conform to zoning because a lot of them developed in like 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, well after zoning was established, well before their annexation into Richmond even. So the zoning might actually like pencil out there, but that doesn't mean like if we're looking to the future, right, establishing zoning that answers Richmond 300, for instance, might allow a like legacy family in one of those districts to sell part of their property.
It eliminates
For
the
a house.
non-conformities.
Right. So like, I just want to make sure I'm not misunderstanding this pattern book. And if we're going to be also looking at areas that do also conform to current zoning, which we don't like either.
So like a large lot in the 8th or
Yes.
9th that could be split into 3 lots. Or
Yes.
2 lots.
Could
We're
it use
looking-
the pattern book that you create? Could they be like, oh, we want to use that the neighborhood pattern and do it over here?
And I might be misunderstanding something else that we're going to be doing later in this whole
You're
exercise.
talking about part 2 of the presentation in a sense, right, where we're looking at Richmond 300 and how does that vision and future match the existing zoning tools that you have today? So we have to use Richmond 300 as our guidance for
Yeah, no, I
future
understand.
zoning.
Yeah.
So the next piece of this is to understand whether the current zoning tools that you have in place match the vision established in Richmond 300.
Okay, so this is just existing conditions
Yeah,
in a way.
Yeah.
it is, but I think, I don't know if this is going to your point, I think there are also, and a reason I think we included Washington Park in here,
Uh-huh.
is that there are a number of parcels that may be conforming,
Okay, great, yeah.
but they're conforming, but there's still a lot of cube in which you can build. And so I think that's also a conversation in terms of, as you look at development, You can right now, in some of those neighborhoods, by right, go in. And right now, there's a pattern of, 1,500 square foot Cape Cod homes, but by right, you could go in and build something 4,000 or 5,000 square feet.
Yeah.
And we're trying to also acknowledge, like, is that also something in terms of how things fit? And in terms of not only, I think, it's both, right? So it's identifying the nonconformities of like Maritza said, like, right, we love these neighborhoods, but like somehow we've made them illegal. But then also looking at neighborhoods which may be conforming, which we also love, but also understanding like they could change very rapidly within.
Philip, was it nonconformities that you wanted to talk about? How that was
My
defined?
question was just
Okay,
answered,
that's what
because
I
it
was
seems to
gonna
me that nonconformity means it's illegal, but it's, so if you had a lot that as Kevin just mentioned, where there could be more building and to fit within setbacks, that would not be considered non-conforming in all of your color coding and statistics. Is that right?
Correct.
Yes,
Right.
correct.
Okay,
Although-
so that's another whole level of analysis. Okay.
Yeah, so Carlos did sort of touch on that briefly with the unbuilt height potential.
He did mention that. I was wondering if unbuilt height is, you're counting that as a non-conformity.
It's not technically a nonconformity. I mean, and it could be desirable or it could not be desirable. So one possibility is you want more intensification in some areas, so you've zoned it up to something, and then it hasn't been fully built out yet, but yeah, it can grow further.
Okay.
There's some places where maybe you gave people too much, permission, and this is, probably the more controversial part, if there's the possibility of clawing back some of that to force people to build things in, better alignment, so you don't have the, monster home problem you get in some places.
Yeah, for example, in terms of parcel size, we did look into, we don't have a map here, it's like a degree of conformity for parcel size, like not just how much small the parcels are from zoning, but also how much bigger they were from the minimum. And they're like in the most suburban parts of the cities where like you can find massive parcels that are way beyond the minimum required, and that also speaks of a pattern. But at the same time, it's that gets more, it affects more the future thinking of what the code would do, rather than we need to identify the existing patterns that the current zoning have completely forgot about. And those are the ones that we're focusing on, which buildings, which parcels today, which neighborhoods today, we don't have numbers and data that will make those legal, right? We need to identify what is the number, what is the parcel size, that and what is the building height, and we will get to block size, to the block level, and that will take us to what is the setbacks. I'm expecting setbacks to also like start highlighting like, we should, all these buildings are not setting back enough for zoning. So we are focusing in identifying those forgotten patterns that the zoning in the 70s, because of the framework in the 70s was different, just completely outlaw what we consider the most traditional neighborhoods in Richmond.
I do have a question. Most of the areas that you're describing are in fact zoned R5 and R6, which in some areas of the city are probably legitimate districts. They're not legitimate where they are. My question is, have you evaluated what the impact on nonconformities would be if you simply took the R8 district and plopped it down on those? Because it was designed specifically for those areas, and I'll bet that you'd find that they would almost come. It's something you certainly ought to look at. It's already on the books.
We haven't done that, but we look at it.
That's what it was. I mean, that sort of analysis that he's talking about was already done when the R8 district was created in order to fit these neighborhoods, and it certainly might make a good starting point for a solution to dealing with that. Also, one other thing that you probably already know is that one of the big problems with setback issues is the current building code would not allow an awful lot of the setback intrusions that now exist. So we have to be really careful that we don't not like frame construction within 3 feet of a property line, things like that. So we have to be really careful about not going too far and checking against other codes which we can't override.
Are there any other pressing questions at this point in the presentation?
Thanks. We can come back to this if something else comes up later on. So I'm going to go through the code framework. So again, this is sort of the flip side of what Carlos was presenting. Again, this is looking at the relationship between Richmond 300's vision for the city in terms of land use and what the current code does. Because again, we talk about implementation methods. Codes are supposed to implement the goals of plans. Ideally, that's what they're intended to do. Obviously, we have a situation where here we have a code that's much older than the current plan. So there's a lot of mismatches between the two. So we're going to sort of take you through a bit of our analysis of where those mismatches are and some of the questions that come out of it, because there's still a fair amount of room for maneuver and flexibility. And so I apologize, there's a lot of text in this presentation. It is meant to be a sort of standalone thing, so we'll make sure that you have a copy of it afterwards to look back on. I'm going to move through this pretty quickly. If there's any, if you don't understand anything, I know there's sort of everybody in the room here, there's a variety of kind of different levels of experience with zoning and planning. So if anybody feels lost, please put your hand up at any point. So I'll try and answer your questions. But we'll save bigger discussion for the end. That's okay. Like I say here, the intent here is to have a code that implements the goals of the plan. The code has to comply with the plan, so we're not at any point trying to reopen anything that was decided in Richmond 300, but there still is a lot of room for maneuver. So a lot of the things, as you see, that Richmond 300 will be saying, and we'll go through each one of its land uses and what it says about them. There's still a fair amount of room for flexibility in terms of apply that on the map. Most of those land uses that are in Richmond 300 are going to get implemented through multiple zoning districts. Right now you've got 10 land uses in Richmond 300. I think it's fair to say we're going to have, by the end of this process, we're going to have more than 10 zoning districts, but I hope fewer than the 38 zoning districts that you have right now. So it's about trying to figure out where we need to make those breaks to identify real things that are different that we really want to capture in separate zones versus trying to avoid redundancies by just having a ton of different zoning districts. So trying to consider those zoning districts really carefully. So the intent of what we're doing right now is just trying to understand the land use vision of Richmond 300, trying to identify where it doesn't align with the current zoning, and try to figure out where whether or not zoning is achieving its aims. And I think there's some places where it maybe is, other places where it isn't. Trying to find opportunities for achieving modest missing middle intensification. That's a general goal of the plan, but looking for opportunities in the zoning districts as we go forward. And then trying to figure out, trying to understand how those future zoning districts should be defined. So we're not presenting any zoning districts yet today. I hope that by September, we're going to have a kind of early set to kind of put in front of you for discussion. But right now, we're just kind of doing that analysis that's going to lead up to it. Here. So the Richmond 300 land use plan here, I know this is really hard, small for you to see, I apologize. We're going to talk about all these in more detail in just a sec. So it's, as you know, the plan was approved in 2020. It has 10 land use categories. They're all mapped out in quite a bit of detail. 6 of those 10 are mixed use in some form, which is amazing. I think it's one of the most kind of progressive things about the Richmond 300 plan was that it allows a lot of flexibility in terms of use. There's general parameters for each one of them. So I know many of you guys know the plan very well. So, but for each one of those different land use categories, there's a whole bunch of different rules around built form in addition to land use. And that goes into development style, ground floor design, mobility, intensity, and also land use. On top of those categories, and again, this is just for reiteration, because I know a lot of you guys are very familiar with this plan. But those categories are overlaid by nodes as well that add extra intensity to them. And those nodes are mapped conceptually. So those are the circles on this map. Obviously, they're not there. The outlines, the specific outlines of those nodes is to be determined. So that's one of the things that when we get into the actual mapping of the zoning districts, we'll have to figure out exactly where we kind of switch from one thing to another. Sometimes extra intensity is also expected along major streets, according to what Richmond 300 says. So in addition to those nodes, there's also major street frontages might get more intensity than the rest of that category. So again, I'm not going to go through all these in detail. This is just a bit of a summary of what's in Richmond 300, but we put this together probably for our own reference. So we're going to go through, this is basically what Richmond 300 says. This is again a summary of what it says about each one of these land uses. It's got specific guidance for each one of these different categories on the left-hand side here. Public land use, institutional, industrial, And then getting into the mixed use categories, corridor mixed use, community mixed use, neighborhood mixed use, residential. Going into the zoning districts. So as you guys know, the zoning code was last comprehensively updated in 1976. Obviously predates Richmond 300 by a long time. Incremental changes have happened since then, including lots of remappings, adding new districts, changing certain requirements. We talked before about ADUs being allowed, getting rid of the minimum parking standards, et cetera. So a lot of changes have been made along the way, but it's still out of step with Richmond 300 in quite a lot of ways, as I'll show you in a sec. And it's also out of step with the existing character of some neighborhoods, as you saw in the previous part of the presentation, resulting in a lot of special use permits to effectively do the same thing that's already been historically existed there. 38 zoning districts, 35 are actually only being used. So there's a couple or 3 zoning districts that are not actually implemented right now. And each one of those zoning districts, again, I think most of you know this, but each zoning district is basically made up of a package of regulations that control things like use, height, lot size, density, and a variety of other parameters. So what are the sort of the full spectrum of zoning districts in Richmond today? You get single family. You get, so there's 5 different single family districts, 2 family districts. Multifamily districts are for things like apartment buildings or condos. There's 1 mobile home district. There's a whole lot of different mixed use districts that allow a variety of some combination of residential and commercial uses. There's 1 exclusively office district. There's 2 industrial districts, and there's 2 institutional districts. But in terms of the percentage of the city, you can see down below here, 59% of the city falls under some form of single family zoning. So huge amount of the city just by area is under these 5 single family zones. And by contrast, you've got a whole lot of mixed use zones that are only covered about 10% of the city. And there's some districts that are, again, they're applied to only very, very specific places in the city. So I overlaying these 2 maps. So the next series of slides we're going to show you are basically taking the plan and overlaying it with the zoning districts and seeing what happens when you look at each one of those land use categories in the plan, and what zoning districts fall under it. So basically it's just taking each one of those. So let's say residential, just zooming through that and just looking through our residential lens, what zoning districts fall within the residential category in the plan. Are they meeting the intents of the residential land use category, or are they not meeting them? And we're going to go through each one of them and sort of take a look at that. In theory, again, the zoning districts should be implementing the goals of the plan, but we know in practice there's a number of discrepancies here. Most of those land use categories include portions of a lot of different zoning districts. So just for the sake of this upcoming analysis we show you, we've excluded ones that are covered less than 3% of that land use. So there's little tiny bits and pieces here and there. At this scale, at this point, I'm not that concerned with those little bits and pieces. I'm more concerned with what are the main zoning districts within each one of these categories. We're looking, I should say, we're looking at the underlying zoning only for these. And so we know there's a lot of special exceptions, especially use permits that have modified permissions on individual lots. So again, I understand that sort of changes things in some places, but we're looking at just for the sake of the citywide analysis, we're looking at the relationship between the plan and the kind of main underlying zoning. So I'm going to go through this one by one. I'm going to start with sort of the simpler ones, and I'll move to the stickier ones later on. So starting with public open space. So what you see on the left-hand side map here is all the public open space areas in the Richmond 300 plan in green. Those are parks and other public open spaces. And then on the right-hand side here, you see, again, zooming into those places only, this is the zoning that gets applied to them. I know it's really hard to see on the scale, so I apologize. Again, we'll give you a digital and hard copy later on. So these are the zones that fall under it. So it's interesting, this is actually the sort of second most common land use in the city, covers 17% of the city, according to Richmond 300. It's implemented by a whole lot of different zones right now. And there's an obvious reason for that, and that's because Richmond doesn't have an open space zone at the moment. So it's basically kind of whatever its context is around it, that's what it is. And this is not unique to Richmond. There's sort of 2 different approaches to open space zoning. Some cities have 1 or more zones for parks or open spaces that would align to this category in the plan. Other cities, they're just kind of parks are allowed in like every different zone basically. And so it's just kind of whatever is around it. So if it's an R1 zone neighborhood and there's a park in that, the park is just part of R1. So again, this is not a huge deal, just kind of flagging this. I think at some point we'll have to decide whether we want to actually create an open space zone going forward or if we kind of continue this approach. So next one here, institutional. So this is the institutional areas in the plan on the left-hand side here. And then again, what happens when you zoom in and look at the zoning. It represents things like college and hospital campuses, also the state capitol complex, but also a lot of smaller things like schools. So there's a whole lot of small institutional areas on the left-hand side map. Richmond does have an institutional zone, but it's kind of, it doesn't cover all of these areas. It usually is used for larger campus type spaces. So you can see in some places here, there's an alignment between the land use category and the zone. In other places, it's other random zones. So if it's like, schools are allowed as part of neighborhoods, for example, in single family areas. So if you find a school in a single family area, that would be zoned single family right now generally. So again, do we want to, again, it's not a huge question, but something that we want to consider later on is we want to kind of more rigorously require zoning, special zoning, institutional zoning for all these smaller institutional uses, or do we want to just allow them to be allowed within other zoning categories? There's pluses and minuses to both. If you require that they be their own special category, it might require a lot of amendments. If you, for example, deactivate a school and turn it into something else, you're going to have to rezone it. If you want to create a school on property that was previously a neighborhood, you're going to have to rezone it. At the same time, maybe it adds more clarity. But this is not a huge thing. And also, I should just add that a lot of public institutions in Richmond are actually not required to comply with zoning anyways. So it's not like we're going to be using zoning to change the built form of the state capitol complex or whatever. Okay, industrial. So these are areas for manufacturing. These are exclusively industrial areas. So there's a separate category called industrial mixed use. These are areas that are really intended for manufacturing and other types of industrial uses going forward. There's basically two different zoning categories, M1 and M2. And this one works pretty well. There's a pretty good alignment. There's a tiny corner of this area that's planned for industrial that is zoned residential today. It's like a little block, and I'm not actually sure what the story is with that. Area around Twyman Road in South Richmond. So there might be some backstory with that as to why there's an intention that area should become industrial going on. But the vast majority of this area is well aligned between the plan and the zoning. The only question I think I might ask going forward is, because we've got a lot fewer industrial uses now than we used to in the past in Richmond, do we still leave these two zones? There's a heavy and a light industrial zone. Could they maybe be combined for efficiency later on into one industrial zoning district? I'm not sure. But this is essentially what they are. So M1, light industrial, M2, heavy industrial. And so for these ones here, again, not expecting you to be able to read all this stuff. We kind of lined up the kind of guidance here from the plan. This column here. So this is basically what I showed you earlier on in the presentation. We went for each use, lined it up with some of the highlights from the zoning right now. So these are the zones that you would typically find under industrial, mostly M1 and M2. This is what it says. When we go through each one of these sections here, we'll kind of line these up. Not a big deal under industrial, but for some of the others, there's actually some specific metrics like height and stuff, where you can see there's actually like kind of interesting misalignments. So going into the mixed use categories now, downtown mixed use. Most of this downtown area, this is sort of the most intensive mixed use area, obviously, according to the plan. Most of it falls under these the nodes. So it's kind of, I guess it's pretty self-explanatory that downtown is itself a node or multiple nodes. It excludes a couple of kind of big institutional uses around downtown, which fall under the institutional category. It's implemented mostly through mixed use zoning, which is good. That permits high intensities. So B4, B5, and R03. Some of the areas around the Coliseum site are zoned for institutional uses. There's a few other uses in there too. There's a tiny bit of manufacturing and wine in there around Gamble's Hill. I'm going to show you some of these in a sec. So I would say this is not totally far off in terms of the alignment between the zoning and the plan. Only question kind of going forward here is maybe removing or changing some things that are industrial to change to mixed use maybe in the future in downtown to be aligned with the kind of vision for downtown being a vibrant, mixed use, intense place. And maybe thinking about, the specific metrics under these individual mixed use zones. Do we need all of them, or is there a way we can combine them to, a smaller number of zones for downtown, just for the sake of efficiency? So again, lining out these things up here, and again, I'm not going to ask you to look at all these in detail. There's a notion here of a minimum height intensity of 5 stories plus. B5, for example, actually limits height to 5 stories. So there's sort of a misalignment, but I think there's also nuances here that are not necessarily fully captured by Richmond 300, where you get historic portions of areas and things like that as well, that we need to think a little bit more about. But the notion here is that this would be a mixed use intense area with a minimum height of 5 stories, generally speaking. And so just zooming in on a few of these places. So again, theoretically, Richmond 300 is calling for a high intensity transit-oriented development of at least 5 stories across the downtown mixed use area. Some of the specific areas, just zooming into some sites within it today. Much of downtown is zone B4, which permits mixed use with no particular height limitations, as long as there's an appropriate transition to lower intensity uses. So that's fine for most of downtown. Some of the southwest corner of downtown zone B5 that limits height to 5 stories. That's a bit of a kind of historic warehouse area in terms of the character. But so that's sort of a point of tension that we may need to kind of think about how we handle that area. The northeast area of downtown is zoned research park. So that's a sort of area where there's a lot of vacant space, a lot of redevelopment plans for the future. Specifically, the Afton chemical site is zoned manufacturing. Again, so thinking about the future of that site, even if it's going to stay the same thing for the future, probably should be thinking about some sort of a more mixed use zoning in terms of long-term planning measures for the site, if it is going to be part of the downtown area. Destination mixed use. So I'm kind of going down in intensity for the mixed use areas now. So these are areas that are intended to be, according to the plan, key gateways featuring prominent destinations such as retail and sports venues and large employers, as well as housing and open space. Located at the conversions of several modes of transportation, including the Pulse, and other planned transit improvements in a highly walkable environment. So outside of downtown, it's sort of the most intensive mixed use areas. Mostly concentrated nodes. I think it's obvious why that is. The current zoning really varies pretty widely in these areas. So you get some single family zoning going all the way up into mixed use, and even some industrial as well too. Again, so the plan here is calling for a minimum height of 5 stories. Yeah, a lot of districts here actually limit height to 3 stories or less. There's some historic fabric probably around some of the edges of some of these areas as well too. So as we think about the kind of nuances that zoning is supposed to capture, even though this area is supposed to be highly intensive, there might be some corners of this that might have to get some other sort of special, more limiting zoning because of their kind of historic status. So this is the kind of tension that's going to have to work out. And I think it's actually going to be informed by kind of putting together the pattern book piece of work and putting together this piece of work. So this is a sort of situation where there's a misalignment, I think, between the kind of existing patterns and maybe some of the intensity of the plan. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Bear with me for a second. To do development mixed use, destination mixed use is that one, right? Once it changed. I think it says like typically a minimum of 5 stories for downtown, and then for destination it says typically. I think the idea was that that doesn't have to be that, it can be shorter.
Yeah, I understood. So I'm talking about, yeah, I think it does say typically. So there's a possibility of some exceptions. I mean, I think that generally speaking, for all these categories, again, it's pretty broad brushes in Richmond 300. So there's the possibility of adding some more nuance in there.
And I think we were kind of talking it through, we kind of anticipated nuance to be added and more specificity. So
Yeah, so that's exactly where we are right now.
I'd be like, add the word typically in there. My suggestion potentially,
Sure,
just so that
sure.
people are
Destination mixed use. So here are just a few different examples of sort of some really different places. Again, if we were to kind of go up to something towards the very maximum of what it's suggesting here, then you'd be getting something more like what you see on the right-hand side, like one of some of your TOD development stuff. Again, understood that there's, a lot of gradation within here. Just some of the very diverse places in the city, but yet this kind of categorization. You get parts of Broad Street where there is already TOD zoning, so it would be intended to go up to a height like that. You get parts of Shockoe Bottom that have some really different types of forms. And again, sort of the extreme example, the other direction is maybe some of the historic areas here, where we probably would want to limit height well below that maximum intensity. There's some places in between, example of a 5-story building in Shockoe Bottom. This area is actually, B5 is actually zoned for 5 stories. And then sort of something else very different, Stony Point Fashion Park is also considered to be a destination mixed use area. The underlying zoning this place for the mall is actually R2, oddly. So go ahead.
Yeah, so I wanted to sort of harp on that. So Stony Point is an example of a community unit plan, a CUP, which is like our planned unit development ordinance for the city. How did you treat that as part of your analysis? Because it's tough to look at the zoning map. It doesn't really pop in the same way.
So I just said from the scale of this analysis, we're just looking at the underlying zoning. So
Okay.
yes, I know there's all kinds of different exceptions, and community unit plans are one of them. Special use permits on sites is another thing. So I would hope that when we kind of come back and redo the zoning in the next phase of it, that we're going to sort of bring the zoning up to the point where it's clear that that's what the intention is, rather than having to sort of follow a kind of trail to figure out what the real intention is for the site. So we'll see, but yeah. So it's obvious that the Stony Point Fashion Park, even though it's underlying zoning is R2, it's not occupied by single family today. That's not the intention.
In fact, residential is prohibited throughout the development.
Yes. Yeah, that's a strange thing. It's not a clear thing at all. Industrial mixed use. So these are areas that were formerly industrial are now being transitioned to mixed use. Scott's Addition is probably the sort of poster child for this, where you're getting a lot of new development in an area that's formerly industrial. A lot of this area is, so you'll find when you look at the zoning here, it's a kind of mixture of areas that have been rezoned to mixed use things, which accommodate the goal of this, and some areas which are still falling under traditional industrial zoning that wouldn't allow residential and other mixed uses. So they're still basically saying you have to do manufacturing here. And so you bringing these areas up to the intent of the plan would be one of the things that we would probably be looking to do. We'll update the mapping in the future. Includes a very small amount of R5, mostly just like little slivers. That's a single family zone, adjacent to industrial areas. And I think it's fair to say that M1, M2, and R5, those are the manufacturing districts, and the single family zoning don't really meet the intent of relatively high intensity mixed use. But again, when we kind of zoom in here, I think there may be exceptions that get made when we kind of do the sort of very fine grained nuances. And here's the kind of summary table of what these zoning districts are. Some examples here, Scott's Addition, again, sort of poster child for this. Formerly industrial area, currently undergoing a lot of redevelopment, as you know. The B7 area allows up to 5 or 6 stories. Some parts of the Scott's Addition are already zoned TOD, which allows up to 12 stories. But a few other examples of things that fall under industrial mixed use, but are still under traditional manufacturing zoning. Parts of Chamberlain Industrial Center, Commerce Road, those are under M1 and M2. So theoretically, we're thinking about these areas all transitioning to some sort of mixed use, like you see on the right-hand side. That's obviously a building from Scott's Addition at its kind of coarsest level. But again, there might be some gradations that fall under this in terms of height and other things. Corridor mixed use. So these are kind of major commercial corridors, supposed to be allowing for medium to medium high density development. Pedestrian and transit oriented development. So what are these things here? You're going to see a whole diversity of different zones within these. And just looking at the map here on the left hand side, you'll see there's some kind of potential kind of breaks in terms of looking at the form here. You'll see some areas that are really, really deep commercial corridors or mixed use corridors, potential for a whole lot of stuff, multiple buildings. and some that are much more shallow, where you've got neighborhoods happening behind that. So thinking about how you kind of transition in those areas might be very different. So thinking about what land uses you put there, what heights you do, those are just things that are going to be going through our mind when we kind of think about implementing this through, updating zoning districts later on. Right now, the zoning districts are kind of a bit all over the place in this case. You've got some single family residential, you've got some multifamily, some mixed use, and some industrial. Probably fair to say again, the industrial probably doesn't align to the goal of corridor. And the same thing with single family residential. Multifamily residential and mixed use are probably closer to what's intended here, probably particularly mixed use. But I think, as I said, there's some very different spaces here, and sort of thinking ahead to the future and zooming into some of those spaces, they may require different types of built form and different mixes of use to respond to their contexts. So again, zones here. You also see that some of these multifamily zones, so some of these areas, sorry, though they are zoned multifamily, there's real kind of restrictions in terms of what you can build there. So R48, R53, they're relatively low intensity. So R48 up to 3 stories, mixed multifamily, but limited to 19 units per acre effectively. R53, 3 to 5 stories, but limited to 9 units per acre, so super low density. It's almost like a single family level of density. So essentially what R53 is basically saying is that you build a small apartment complex, but you have to have a lot of space around it on the lot, like lots of landscape space or parking lot or whatever to meet those requirements. Through all these, but you can see the height really varies here, 3 stories, 3 to 5, 12, and TOD. So corridor mixed use, some of the really diverse places you find under here. Parts of Broad Street already zoned for TOD. That's pretty close to the intent of the plan. Also some areas down by the waterfront on, this is Dock Street, vacant lands, zoned M2. So those areas still have industrial zoning. The Lothian Turnpike, zone B3. So this is, potential for like a lot of intensity there. These are super deep sites, like the ones I showed you on the map before. Like, again, the sort of the deepest corridor sites. Oops. Here. Those areas are currently zoned, or at least the example on the map there is zone B3, which is up to only 5 stories in height. Chamberlain Avenue, this is the sort of skinny corridor in the north, zone R48. So that's a multifamily zone, not commercial, but multifamily, not mixed use, but limiting height to only 3 stories and requiring setbacks and stuff around it. So it's producing a form like what you see in the drawing of the photo today. But question is, because of the kind of statement in Richmond 300 saying we're looking for up to 10 stories in these areas, or looking for up to 10 stories, do we want to think about intensifying that, or is that okay the way it is? Theoretically, again, maximum kind of these mixed-use buildings up to 10 stories. If we look at kind of, again, the kind of forcist interpretation of the plan. But again, there's going to be, has to be room for transition and sort of gradations that fall under that. So going down through the different mixed-use categories here, these are smaller density, smaller medium density walkable commercial and residential areas, sort of smaller scale corridors. Some of them are more intersections where you have a group of commercial uses that are mixed uses together. Like the corridors, they get implemented through a whole lot of different zones. So these categories probably have the biggest diversity in terms of zoning. So you get some single family zoning under here, some 2-family, multifamily, mixed use. So again, these are probably, mixed use and multifamily comes closer to matching the intents of these. So trying to figure out why some of those areas are not aligned and to look for opportunities to bring those up to alignment with the goals of the plan. But again, like the corridors, there's diversity of different spaces here where we might want different levels of intensity. So to show you photos here, some examples of things that fall under community mixed use. Cary Street in Carytown. So here's an example of a large commercial site along one of these areas. Zone B3 currently allows up to 5 stories. The intent for community mixed use in Richmond 300 is to allow up to 6 stories at its most intent. So pretty closely aligned with what that is right now. On the other hand, a few other places where it's quite different. So Grove and Libby zoned UB urban business, that's limited to only 2 stories. So the question is, what we think about the future of that area. Do we want to kind of allow more intensity to bring up to 6 stories or something like that? Or do we want to leave it lower? Williamsburg Road and Phil Hill, limited to 3 stories, but also requiring a 25-foot front setback, despite the existing form. So you can see here again, this is an example of basically a traditional storefront building, but technically the zoning says you have to have a 25-foot front setback there. So that's an example again of the pattern book thing of the existing forms not matching zoning. And then somewhere else quite different, Rog Rock and Walmsley, zone B2, also the same thing, but again, very different existing form there. So again, theoretically limited to 3 stories and big setbacks. Do we want to allow that to go up to 6 stories as well? Don't know. So again, all these areas are kind of in the same basket in the plan, but there's room for nuance, I think. I'm just trying to suggest that there's, again, a lot of different things in here. So neighborhood mixed use, this is the second last one now. So we're now getting down to these areas that are, the plan says existing or new highly walkable urban neighborhoods that are predominantly residential with small but critical percentage of parcels providing retail, office, personal service, and institutional uses. So one thing I immediately observed about this is that it kind of combines at least 2 different categories of things. It includes some of the urban traditional neighborhoods, in the city, the Fan, a lot of Church Hill, those areas, some of them that were touched on before by Carlos, but also a lot of these kind of outlying multifamily areas in the sort of the south of the city. So some of these are like townhouse complexes and things like that. So again, do we treat these areas the same or do we treat them differently? Is the intent that these, if we kind of enshrine something along the sort of existing condition in the zoning here, is the intent that these areas here would eventually become more like that? Or do they have their own paths that are separate from each other? So neighborhood mixed use, it's supposed to accommodate multifamily, but as you can see here, there's actually some single family zones in here. So those don't really meet the intent of this category. There's also multifamily zoning, which is good. That does more or less meet the intent. But like I said before, some of those multifamily zones are very low density in nature and produce forms that are not very urban. So in places like the Fan or whatever, those don't really make sense. Maybe they do in some of the southern areas. And then you've got a little bit of mixed use and some office in there as well.
Hey, can I just make an observation and sort of drop in a footnote on the last point about the density and whether it works for some of the multifamily classifications? As one of your footnotes noted, when you were trying to create an apples to apples comparison of density for the different multifamily districts, some of them do it by lot size and then some of them do it by an overall units per acre, which is not directly comparable. So it was nice that you kind of created some equivalency. That was helpful. But we also have an affordable density bonus program, and that's only usable in one of those cases and not in the other.
Right.
And so just as a footnote to sort of keep an eye on as part of your framework, can density be controlled in a way that is common and sort of consistent across zoning classifications so that there may be some other policy objectives that can be incentivized accordingly?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, just to bring this to other people's attention, these little footnotes in the bottom here. I have 2 conversions in these tables here just to make it clear. In the sort of what we took from Richmond 300, which is this column here, it talks about maximum height in terms of stories, and at least in a couple of the land uses, it talks about density in terms of units per acre. So we converted heights to stories and density to units per acre. We took those from in the existing zoning. Heights are sometimes controlled by feet instead of stories. So it kind of made an approximation for the number of stories. This is just for reference here. But as just to let you know, at least some or most of the zoning districts control it in feet. Like some of it control it in stories. The density is controlled through two different ways as well, through units per acre in some cases, and through, as you say, maximum number of units per maximum square footage per unit, lot area per unit. So it's a sort of a back way to kind of essentially establish maximum densities.
Good question, Renee.
Oh, sorry.
Really quick, just
Yeah.
with that, not to get too in the weeds, I know you're pulling a lot of information together here. For R53 specifically, the minimum lot area per dwelling unit is 1,250 square feet for each dwelling unit. So that it's not 9 units per
It's about
acre.
35.
Yeah.
The 5,000, it looks like it says
Yeah, tricks you.
multifamily on lots of 5,000 square feet. It's not each unit is 5,000 square feet. It's the whole development. Has to be at least 5,000 square feet.
Okay, so we may have made a mistake there, apologize.
No, yeah, you're good.
Yeah,
Just
yeah.
wanted- in case
It's about 35 units per acre.
in case this were to go to a public
Yeah.
meeting and someone were to freak out.
Okay, well, we can fix that, yeah.
So the language isn't 100% clear.
Yeah, no, we may have made a mistake. In any case, it is a relatively low density compared to some of the intents of the plan, even if it is 35. Neighborhood mixed use over here. So yeah, just to give you some examples, again, sort of the very diverse things that fall into this. You got the fan, as I mentioned before, most of that is zoned R6, single and two family uses. However, you got some, scattered multi-use or multifamily buildings in there, as well as some mixed use. So again, this is again to the question of the pattern book again. Do we want to sort of take those things that are non-conforming and bring that whole area up to allow those areas? So we allow those same sort of small multi-family buildings and shops that you see scattered, throughout the fan historically. We allow those throughout the whole area, or do we want this to continue to be a kind of non-conforming thing? So that's a question for us to answer, but I think that the intent of the plan, as I understand it, is probably to bring those things up into conformity and to allow more of that to happen, as long as it doesn't violate, again, historic protections. Some of the other very different areas here. So part of Union Hill, zone R63. So it allows for small multifamily buildings up to 4 stories with mixed uses on corners. So it's actually a little bit more intensive than what you get in the fan. Probably get closer to describing the intents of this category. But also going off to kind of some of those more suburban mixed use areas. Here's one, south side, zone R48. So requiring substantial setbacks, which matches what you see in that picture. Again, thinking about this in the long term of the future, do we want areas like this to kind of continue to be their own thing under these parameters, or do we want these areas to kind of eventually look more like this by kind of putting them into a similar zoning district? So that's again a question thinking about the future. You also get some areas under this neighborhood mixed use category that are just more kind of typical suburban single family areas as well. And so again, do we want to think about intensifying those? I guess the plan is intended that we intensify them, but up to how much? We go all the way up to the maximum of 4 stories and mixed use multifamily, or is there something in between that? And then so again, so this is sort of the maximum intent of this category here is landing us with something like this. We want to go there in all cases, or is there something else?
In the conversations about that one, I think people always are talking about, planning director was talking about there being like probably multiple zoning districts that achieve neighborhood mixed use. Wouldn't be like everything becomes like the image on the right.
No.
Wanna like.
Yeah, no, that's I put a question mark there. So that's what we're trying to solve right now, exactly, right? So this whole kind of period of conversation is like, so we have 10 different land uses. How many zoning districts are we going to get? It's not going to be 10. It's going to be something more than 10, but is it going to be 20 or is it going to be 30? We don't know exactly where the breaks are going to be. So this is kind of the conversation I want to have. And part of what we got at some of the questions we were asking at the last ZAC meeting as well too, we're trying to feel out what are your kind of priorities for those breaks. And so for some of these categories, it might be a 1-to-1 for like parks, institutions, maybe industrial even, I don't know. Well, there's 2 industrial zones today. But for some of these ones here, like neighborhood mixed use and residential, those are probably the ones that are going to have the most breaks. They cover the largest parts of the city, and there's probably also the strongest feelings about what goes into.
Hey, Renee, along those lines, if you go back to that last slide, that's the first place I've seen you mention this concept that's in Richmond 300 about primary and secondary uses.
Yes,
So that means something, right?
it does.
In Richmond 300, I don't know that it's defined specifically what that means, but to me, it's sort of a majority or predominant and then a minority or smaller usage, but that needs to be figured out. Maybe that becomes a separate zoning category within, or I don't know. That's something that needs to be dealt with because there was a lot of attention paid to what was primary and what was secondary.
Yeah, for sure. So I think when we're thinking about those breaks, that's what's going to inform some of that. So there could be, let's say there's two different zoning districts. The primary one covers most of the area. Maybe there's a smaller number of areas covered by the secondary one. Or maybe it's something else where things are allowed under certain conditions that are more
On
limited.
corners or something,
Corners is an example of some
Or
of the way it's done. Some
major
existing
roads.
There is that concept in some of the long major roads. It's their secondary use, but not.
So the last one now, residential. So this is covering 42% of the city. So not quite as much as actually the single family zoning does today. Still the largest land use category in the plan. So the intent of it is neighborhoods consisting mostly of single family houses on large or medium sized lots. They're fairly homogeneous in nature. The secondary use, which again, to mention that, is the possibility of allowing duplexes and small multifamilies on major street frontages within this area. So where you get major streets going through neighborhoods, those areas, according to the plan, would be upzoned. Exactly which ones and how much is still to be determined. On this area right now, you can see that these are almost all single family zoning. So R1 through R5 is single family zones. So it doesn't accommodate that duplexes and multifamily along major streets. And the differences between these single family zones mostly relate to minimum lot size and minimum lot width. And so I think one of the questions we have thinking about going forward is, do we need all these breaks? Could some of these single family areas be consolidated together for efficiency? And what would that mean? How strongly do people feel about minimum lot sizes and minimum lot widths? Could you allow a smaller lot size in some areas that have a certain standard? Could you allow more flexibility with lot sizes going forward? That's to be discussed. There's one here for the last two family residential. It's R6. Categories. And some examples again of some of the very diverse things. If you're going to go up to the most intense duplexes and small multifamily, I guess it could actually be a little bit more than this. Duplexes, not multifamily. But let's say thinking about areas that are on major streets within the residential includes Monument. I would say Monument Avenue in this example here. Huguenot Road, very different, almost rural kind of major street frontage. Meadow Bridge Road, more of a kind of smaller, kind of tighter area. Broad Rock Boulevard, very big open space with institutional uses across the street. So just again, some of the very diverse places that fall into that category of major streets. Theoretically, these areas are all supposed to undergo or some level of intensification in terms of permissions. Whether they all go all the way up or exactly how we map that out is to be determined. And the vast majority of residential, the interior parts of these neighborhoods stay the same. So let me just kind of wrap up here. So key takeaways, Richmond 300 has a clear minimum tension, clear intention for each future land use, including its built form. So again, for those who were involved in the process, it's interesting that the plan goes pretty far into built form, more than a lot of plans do traditionally, not just land uses. The intentions are usually stated in a way that allows for some flexibility, as we've said, meaning there's room for some degree of variation and nuance. It's not always saying everything has to be one thing. So this is really the purpose of what we're doing now, is trying to figure out where that nuance is going to be. In some cases, the future land uses groups together places that are noticeably different in character. So some of those examples that I showed you today, it's putting together, again, the fan with some, suburban townhouse complexes, requiring zoning to try to determine what sort of different requirements there might be for those. For example, maximum heights, range of permitted uses, et cetera. In terms of how the existing zoning is doing. I think oftentimes there's a mismatch between the goals of Richmond 300 and the permissions of the zoning districts. Should be no surprise to anybody today. As we said, the zoning was created long before the plan and doesn't necessarily match it. I would say in general, zoning districts tend to be more restrictive in terms of uses and heights and less urban in terms of their built form standards than the goals of the plan. Again, that's no surprise either. They're produced in very different eras. But again, the question is, are we going to go all the way towards the maximum that the plan says, or do we stop somewhere before that point? In only a few cases are zoning districts more permissive than what's in the plan. So that's another thing we need to think about. Are we actually going to take away permissions from people to match the intent of the plan? We probably would keep that to the very minimum in case, unless there are situations. The only kind of substantial example I can think of is industrial areas that have now been converted to mixed use. So those areas, if you change their zoning, you're going to be effectively allowing them a lot more permission in terms of mixed use, but you might be taking away their permission to do new industrial uses in the future beyond what they have right now. Probably not a lot of other examples of that, but there are some things around height in some situations where there's a maximum height that's permitted that goes beyond what the intent is of the plan for that category today. Only a few places. So in terms of what we do next, we started doing an economic feasibility analysis. We need to keep working on that. Part of that is to kind of determine when we do upzoning in some places, are we going to get the goals of what we want? So let's say we want to get intensification, we want to get more affordable housing. Is upzoning that particular way or allowing that particular kind of thing going to help us achieve that? I think we're thinking particularly about missing middle type developments. So when we go into somewhere that's low intensity today, we allow them some more opportunities to build higher intensity uses. Is there going to be real uptake on that, or are we just basically permitting something that nobody would ever build anyways? In which case, what's the point? Or we're going to be permitting something that's going to produce something that's unintended in some other way in terms of becoming more expensive or something else that would be not desirable. There's going to be obviously input from the engagement events from you guys today and from other the public meetings this week. Integration of the zoning code framework and the pattern book analyses. So the two presentations we saw today, we're going to be putting some more of that analysis together to kind of clear out some points where they might be kind of running up against each other. And we're going to be coming back with a draft set of zoning districts, preliminary set of zoning districts for discussion with you guys. They're going to be defined really in broad terms based on a few metrics only. We won't get into all the detail yet. It's going to be for after November. And some of those might appear under more than one future land use category. So one thing is, it's easy to think about these as being sort of nested right now, that each land use category has zones nested within it. I would say that some zones may actually appear in more than one land use category going forward. So it could be that some corridor mixed use zones are the same as some destination mixed use zones. If if it's basically the same thing, there's no point in having it twice, right? So some of the zones may actually go across more than one land use category. And we're also going to be producing some materials to test and workshop in terms of these districts. So we'll be modeling out some things and trying to figure out what could happen in some scenarios. So that's the end of the presentation for now. Questions? Yeah.
Just a quick one. How is open space zoning not considered a taking?
Not considered.
How is open space zoning not considered a taking?
The taking. Well, I'm assuming that what you would be doing would be just taking existing open spaces and putting them into open spaces.
Publicly owned open space.
They're publicly owned open spaces. So,
Okay, so we're not talking about going in and zoning private.
No.
well, so it would be aligned to the public open spaces
I
category of
don't
the
think you
plan,
get too
which
far.
my understanding is the public open spaces category of the plan is existing public open spaces that are publicly owned. So I wouldn't say we'd be taking.
Does that really create any benefit since it's publicly owned?
Not really. It's more just a question of
I mean,
clarity.
it looks good. I mean, I don't mean that facetiously. It does look
It could also be privately owned.
Yeah.
Wanted to protect it as open space.
Yeah, if it's something you went after and voluntarily pursued, yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think, I didn't spend a lot of time on the presentation. I don't think it's a big deal. It's more just for clarity's sake in the zoning.
Something interesting that you may or may not be familiar with in Virginia. It's true that a significant amount of public uses are state and federal, and therefore exempt from zoning. But interestingly enough, some of the stuff the state does for a variety of reasons having to do with leasing rather than owning. They have like some kind of a private entity that actually buys and develops property and then leases it back to the state. That is subject to some.
Is that-
So there are some, what you might perceive as being, public uses out there that actually are subject to some. A lot of VCU.
VCU Foundation, there's a lot of property
VCU
on
Foundation.
the east side of Belvedere.
Yeah. I don't think they realized that when they decided on that strategy, but that's the bottom line.
They realize it when they do code enforcement.
Yeah, exactly.
Charlie, did you have a question?
Is this stuff going to be posted on the website?
No, I don't think so. I think it's gonna be given to you guys.
Oh,
though.
no, the presentation will be on the website.
Will be? Okay. Okay.
This will be on the website.
This will be on,
Okay.
yes, I just asked staff to
Okay.
try to get it up there early tomorrow. So
Okay.
you guys couldn't really see it.
Let me fix that mistake though for you first.
There's a couple more.
A couple more mistakes.
Well,
You have some people who've spent a lot of time in zoning. work.
Could you take some time just to like fix some
Sure.
things and then get it posted? Yeah. Days or a day.
Would you prefer that for those that will have corrections, they filter them all through Mary Ann, or Mary Ann can send them to you?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's go through Miriam.
Yeah.
It's not a question, but just a comment. This is an incredible amount of data and a really effective presentation. The graphics that you did, I thought it told the story really effectively. So thanks for all the diligence. This is exciting to kind of see this as an incremental step toward the goal.
To echo that, the 69% of Jackson Ward is non-conforming, I mean, those kind of stats are like really good to share. We need to make sure we get the messaging right about it.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that's wrong.
Yeah.
That means you're wrong. But that's like, I'm excited to dig into the analysis for all the other neighborhoods too.
Does anyone?
Yeah, I'm just, I don't, that, I'm just wondering if we ought to schedule sometime, the next meeting to maybe come back with questions and discussion points about this. I mean, this is great. I agree. Impressive, but obviously we're all seeing it for the first time on the screen.
That's a good.
As opposed to moving into something else.
That's a great idea,
Fair
because it is a lot of information to digest, and when you get the presentation, I'm sure things will come up. So, Mary Ann, if we could maybe reserve some time on the next agenda, that would be great.
Can I just say, if we're getting corrections and instant comments, do we want to sort of give a certain period for it, Marianne, like a day or two, and then we'll
Sure, if you can get it by the end of the week.
fix everything by then? Yeah, let us know if there's anything that's factually wrong. In terms of the kind of the gradations and the sort of the nuance, we definitely understand that point, but we can make it clearer in terms of the text.
One more thing. Is the idea to come up with a sort of preliminary draft of districts that fit these, especially these 10 neighborhoods that you identified?
Yeah.
And then subsequent to that, go in and then do further modifications to start implementing elements of the master plan?
Well, I think that there's sort of two different things. I think that this is what I mean by kind of the pattern book and this framework analysis coming together. So there's some places where we've been working mostly separately, honestly, so far, but sort of right, there's a few points where those two things potentially contradict each other, where I think generally speaking, you may have situations where the plan says intensify this area. The pattern book says, preserve these kind of historic patterns in a certain way and legalize them, which may be an upzoning over the current zoning, but it might be a step down from what the plan says at its maximum intensity.
That was my question.
So trying to square that, I think is going to be.
I think there's room in the plan to do that, because in one of the sections, I don't know the number, it talks about, preserving and
Sure.
the unique character between
Yeah.
historic neighborhoods.
Yeah.
And so I think that's, I wouldn't,
No, we're definitely, we're following the plan. I'm not saying at any point that we're disagreeing with the plan. I'm just saying that, again, sort of taking the kind of maximum and then this kind of historic analysis together and trying to find, what point you land when you overlay them, right?
May I answer that question? as well. I think one of the things, and I've been clear about, is part of this analysis and looking at the non-conformities, right? I mean, you have these they're legal, but non-conforming. Is there an opportunity before we get into like a full refresh to look at either A, for some of these zoning districts, and in particular R5 or R6, to adjust things within them, right? To get the lot sizes and lot widths or other things adjusted to like what they really are on the ground. Those tweaks, I'll say, as an interim approach before we work on the rest of it. And that can be an offshoot, and I'll say a Band-Aid, but it's a way to like really, look at, I'll say legalizing if the intent is to, that's part of the community conversation, right? If the intent is like, we want these neighborhoods to be like they are and then legalize them, then we shouldn't have that discussion about, do we make some amendments to the current code to allow them to be, I acknowledge we're not gonna get 100% conformance, but we should do better than 31%. So is there some way, this thing we can do in between to like get them legal in the interim?
Yeah, I think the technical challenge to that is that some of those areas, if you look at the zones, the zoning does work for some places, but not for others, right? So if you amend the permissions under a particular zone, you're solving it in some places, but you're creating a problem somewhere else, right?
Correct.
Potentially.
So it's the alternate approach, I think, as you had said, are some, right, or just a initiated rezoning, right? And this is part of the process question, right? In terms of like, at what timing is right? In terms of like doing an interim fix, or how close are we to a full fix on some of those things, where you said, right, if R8 was designed to actually be some of these neighborhoods, well, we have it on the books, but we never applied it to the places that it should be. I will say we did do some of that with the rezoning TOD on West Broad. We brought Carver and Newtown West, basically, I'll say, up a notch to try and be closer to like what they were from R6 to R7, and one from R7 to R8.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's two things. There's the palette of zones that you have, and then there's where they're mapped, right? So you probably could solve a lot of problems today just by remapping using your existing zones.
That might
Probably
be
not.
time.
Yeah, but probably not all of them. Yeah.
If you were to do that, are you better just waiting and doing it as part of the?
That's the question, right? I think this body to
also
look at.
think, I mean, you have choices here as a community. You don't have to necessarily wholesale change your zoning map to match your future land use map. Right, because that future land use map is looking out 20, 30, 40, 50 years, right? So, you have a choice here. It's like, do you want to do it incrementally? Do you want developers to do it over time to come forward with rezonings over time? Or you as a community want to change your zoning all at once so that it does a better job matching your plan? I think that's kind of a decision you guys need to talk about and think about moving forward as well.
So yeah, I mean, an example of that would be like, a stark example would be like, I don't know, one of the mixed use areas where you have remnant industrial zoning. Do you go in and rezone those industrial properties? They would still be allowed to continue their operations as is. But they would become non-conforming at that point, and the intent would be that would move towards mixed use. So do we do that right now? Which, I think that might cause problems if an industrial use shuts down and then a new one wants to start up later on the site, or if you want to change it to a much more intensive industrial use. Or do we just say, the plan represents a long-term intention, and we're going to wait for those landowners to come forward and zoning to mixed use at some point when they're ready to do that.
For it's worth, that's what happened in Scott's Addition. Effectively, it had been all light industrial trucking, and then SUP, and at some point, the neighborhood began to flip, and then it was all master rezoned. There were still those industrial remnants that were continued to be allowed as non-conforming.
It's like the TOD zoning too.
Yeah.
On Broad, for example, was a proactive rezoning by the city.
Yeah. I mean, I would suggest that you probably do want to do a lot of rezoning proactively to match the plan, but maybe not 100%. There might be some category of things that you hold back.
I've noticed that a lot of our conversation has been about Euclidean, we're sort of talking about district here, and the uses are generally consistent with that, along with some mixing of uses. But I guess we're sort of talking a little bit about form in the context of what's recommended as part of the Richmond 300 plan, but just sort of curious as to whether you see any strategic advantage, and we're trying, in terms of trying to reach a greater conformance of existing built environment to the overlaid zoning regulation. Do you see our regulations pivoting from more of that Euclidean definition to more of fungible kind of form-based configuration? I know that's sort of an esoteric question, but just sort of curious how the form enters into sort of your thought process as we begin to flesh out the framework.
So first go on.
We will be heading in more of a form-based direction, I think, with all the new zoning.
And that, to me, that's consistent with the intent of the plan. The plan places a lot more emphasis on form than I think plans historically did. Those quote unquote land use categories are actually a lot about form.
When we look at your allowed use table, for example, we would be trying to consolidate the use categories or the use terms so that more uses fit into a broader set of uses, for example, so you don't have a whole bunch of specific uses. So really consolidating uses down, focusing less on use and more about the built outcome, how buildings address the street, how we experience them as human beings, and less focus on the actual use of a property.
Is that a mix of form-based and performance-based zoning, or?
What's performance? I mean,
You're not worried about uses pretty much at all, as long as it conforms to impact, I guess, and.
We would still regulate use. It just wouldn't be the emphasis of what we're doing. So we'll still, have residential areas, for example. We'll have industrial areas, for example. But maybe there'll be a lot more mixing of uses in between.
Yeah, I guess I just think about future, right? And think about how quickly things can change. And so how can we adapt to these uses that pop up, right? Short-term rentals or data warehouses out in Henrico, something we don't have to worry about, right? But, that type of future forecasting by not restricting so much to specific uses could be beneficial.
We'll try as hard as we can to consolidate uses down to as much as people are comfortable. You could have residential, commercial, office, industrial, and it's like broadest set of uses, and you could regulate that way. But not sure if we'll get there, so we'll work pretty hard to consolidate it down as we can get it.
Yeah, I think some of the questions we're going to be asking the public during the open house this week are thinking about in places where, like in the neighborhood mixed use category, we're going to allow some commercial or mixed uses in some of those neighborhoods going forward. Does it matter to you whether it's a hair salon or a bar or whatever, right?
Yeah, well,
I'm trying to figure out where you land with that.
I guess I'm thinking selfishly, tried to develop a agri-hood in Chesterfield, or so things like that are trendy, right? That could pop up, that are innovative though, and beneficial to the community.
I mean, home-based business is a good one.
Yes.
How far can we get on that spectrum and still people be comfortable that living in their neighborhoods are not going to be necessarily impacted? How far can we allow it to on the spectrum of a business in a neighborhood?
So are the materials for the open houses different from what you're sharing here?
Well, we're not presenting any new analysis. It's a much kind of abridged version of this, and it's just on some boards. There's not going to be a presentation, and there's going to be a couple of questions about it that we're going to be asking people. And so the questions are mostly about sort of feeling out those nuances. So we're asking people to kind of take a look at the map and sort of give us some opinions about the kind of range of heights that you'd like to see in different areas within, let's say, destination mixed use or corridor mixed use. And also, I think there's a question within neighborhood mixed use about uses as well too, like I was saying, yeah. What sort of, mixed uses do you feel okay with in these areas?
When Charlie had mentioned something about also taking into consideration like places that are conforming, but are maybe problematic in a way. Like it's harder to pull that information because it's not necessarily gonna be a mismatch. And it seems like a lot of those situations would be things that would be discovered in the community sessions or, because it's not necessarily like, oh, this place went up and it doesn't match the zoning. They did everything right, but it still is not fulfilling, whatever the community need or something, but it's gonna be harder to identify those things because those are the ones that often go under the radar and are not as easy to catch. Like how would we even pick up on those conforming?
Something that was, using the current zoning that match the neighborhood character, for example.
Yeah.
I think we've talked a little bit about, we're not quite there yet, right? Kind of future build out scenarios. And I think Util's done some things, right? In terms of how big could you actually build on this parcel? Right? And is that what you get at in terms of like under building this? And I think about, I said Washington Park, but I also think about parcels in parts of South Side where you have that situation, right? Where you have I'll say you have a 1,200 square foot home, but by right, you could probably build something 4,000 square feet. And in terms of like, I think, are you asking for us to ask the question, like, are we okay with that? Or do you want us to ask or understand some of those items?
Like if a lot of the data is based off of mismatch, but there's still a lot of information and changes that can be made on things that are matching, like how do we take those things into consideration? Because it's harder to get the data of those maybe newer projects or, because it's not necessarily going to be like something that you can go to the city and be like, okay, this had, it's just, I think that's what's hard is like finding those middle, something that's like, maybe they did everything right. It went through the process, but like this mixed use building wasn't done as efficiently or effectively. And, and that's only going to be, it's harder, like that's the problem is it's harder, when there's a challenge to get the data and it's harder, then those things often just go,
You're kind of suggesting we should be asking the general public a little bit.
like, I think that's,
Good question to ask them.
yeah, that's when you're gonna get the feedback on those things, like, because I don't know how else we would be able to take those projects into consideration because it had to,
What projects are being built recently that you don't like or something like that?
or just like taking into consideration places that are forming,
Mhm.
but maybe don't fit.
Mixed use thing.
Yeah, or
I was just gonna suggest that I think keying off of what she's saying, the community doesn't often hear about a project unless it is a special use permit. So they don't see it unless it doesn't fit. And so if in a neighborhood, you're building something that fits,
I don't like that.
but maybe it just continues to be more of the same, that the question may be, what would you like to see in the neighborhood? Because if it's more of what you see in XYZ neighborhood, you're never gonna get that with B3 because you've got to be back 25 feet.
feet.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think that might be more of the question,
Yeah,
just because you really are never gonna, until it is built, that's the first time the general public would really be aware of a by right development.
yeah. I mean, I think we're definitely going to be we're going to be doing visualizations of some of the new districts as we sort of create them. There's an opportunity to sort of test drive those and sort of see how do you feel about something of this scale in this area and that sort of thing. I guess in terms of things that have already happened, show us some examples and maybe there's more we can be doing to sort of look at areas where permissions exceed what might be wanted. I mean, basically, I think that's what we're saying is areas where there's too much permission. It's a controversial issue because it implies clawing back permissions for people. Some people want.
Yeah, I think there's two things. There could be that, but there could also be just the underlying zoning being more vehicular oriented.
Right.
And so you get something that is a fine one-story strip center, but may not be what the community envisions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think that's what the plan envisions.
I mean, we saw some of that when we were doing our analysis, right, with the suburban setbacks.
Yeah, the
In B.
B2s and whatever.
I don't have a question, it's more of a comment. I just want to make sure everybody is being as intentional as possible with the environment, because I'm really concerned when I see green spaces disappearing. I've been looking all over Richmond. I've been here a long time. I was bringing some relatives who hadn't been here in a long time, and they were like, oh, I like these buildings, but what happened to all the trees and what happened to all the green spaces? They remember when they were kids and there were actually things growing. I think I've said this before, when we had soil and not dirt. Everything's dirt now because everything has been grown and pollution, and we have to think about the environment and trying to protect as much as possible. So yes, it's great to develop, it's great to change, but you also have to have a balance where you're not creating toxic pollutants for your children and your grandkids and the people that are to have the earth that's left, if there's anything left after all these building and changes are done. Be conscious about that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that we're talking about intensifying, but there definitely is like places for, minimum landscaped areas and setbacks and tree coverage requirements and that sort of stuff.
Do you foresee anything as like building off that, anything as technical as like a floor area ratio type of strategy, saying it's more about how much square foot you get to build on your lot versus how tall your building could be? Like you might have a 4,000 square foot one-story building, and you might have a 4,000 square foot with a 1,000 square foot footprint configured as a 4-story building. Stuff like that's kind of like a 1980s, 2000s zoning idea, but
we would want to stay away from that.
I can
Unless folks are telling us to do something like that.
I can understand not wanting to do that from an administration standpoint, for sure.
Well,
But
also
it's
just
like
from a kind of form intention standpoint.
FAR, stuff like FAR.
Yeah. And then there's it's kind of stuck in the middle with the, environmental ideas, because you need to densify to limit transportation impacts of gasoline and other fossil fuels at the same time. And you have to do that at a regional level, right? Like we're an independent city and we don't really cooperate with outlying localities in the way that we should, but you could argue the harm that just being done in, Chesterfield, Hanover, and Rico from a deforestation standpoint is like worse at a macro level than what we're doing at a micro level. So, but it's tricky, right? Like people need places to play and
There's a balance, because I'm just thinking about the deer that are coming in my yard. They're probably looking around like, why do they have to come in my yard now? Because there's nowhere else for them to go. They have no option. But I'm in the city. I'm not in the county. It's just ridiculous. It's not fair to them. They can't speak up and come to the meetings.
We have, I just want to be mindful of time. We're getting to the end. So Wayne.
Yes, just 2 quick questions. The first one is, this information is going out to the public, correct?
Yeah, once we fix a few things, yeah.
Of course, okay. Is it possible, or would it make sense to have a basic, and basic may be relative, but a basic definition of like key terms for those who may not understand zoning?
We actually have, that's one, Latoya's way back in the back here from our engagement team. I know that we've put together a document that includes some definitions of key terms, amongst other things that we can.
Maybe a little bit more high level, or no?
It's pretty high level.
So for those of you who are coming to the workshop, but even if you aren't, we have a number of materials at the actual workshop open houses that are happening later this week. One of them, when you come in, is actually a roadmap. The back of that roadmap actually has about 10 different definitions of relevant terms, even the basic of what is zoning. So trying to just boil down some of these very technical terms that people are going to see as they move throughout the open house, but even as they review this presentation online or they review future content. So that's specifically what we have set up for this week, but we anticipate there's gonna be some other terms that start coming out over the next several months of this process. That again, will continue to update that and provide context for that. But I do believe we'll also be putting all of the workshop content online as well. So obviously you can't make that, that'll be available online as a resource also.
Any other questions? If you have edits that need to be submitted to Renee, filter those to Mary Ann by the end of the week. And we will get a copy of this presentation and then also work in some time at the beginning of the next meeting to maybe have some follow-up discussion.
Meeting dates.
I am, I'm good with that. Yep, sorry. Preston's almost 2 steps ahead of me. So the next meeting of the advisory council is September 11th at 4 p.m. here at the Plan RVA boardroom. There are also 2 opportunities to participate in the code refresh discussion this week with the open houses. And those are Thursday, August 15th from 4 to 7 at the Main Street Library, and then Saturday, the 17th from 10 to 1 at Studio 2-3. And then also staff is working on setting up the zoning panel discussion for September 11th after this committee meeting. That was one that was, I guess, postponed from earlier in the summer. So those are all the announcements that I have.
Where's the second open house?
The second open house is at Studio 2-3, 109 West 15th Street. And those are posted online on the city's zoning code refresh page. And I've seen them go out through this email. If you're signed up to receive emails from the city through the, I guess it was the Richmond 300 list that you're using?
Yep.
Okay. So there's still 5 minutes. You moving up and down for questions. So I'm going to give you 5 minutes back to your day and we're going to adjourn.
I can sense, yeah, we're not talking about.
How are you?
Yeah, good to see you again.
There's litigation.
There's a lot.